Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Housing Options Part 2 Financing, presented by David Gates. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Ernie, for introducing this session. This is one of several sessions that Vision for Equality is doing under our grant from the Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council entitled Housing Myth Busting. So the last session we did, we got into a fair amount of detail about planning for having a home of your own, all that's involved in that. And you should have the slides from that, or you can obtain them from Vision. But because there was so much information, we decided to split it into two sections. So this one is going to focus more on financing. But I'm going to actually go back to some slides. There we go. Housing types, to revisit this, because that is an integral part of financing. How you finance the housing in part depends on what type of housing you're going to use. So rental is the most common because it has lower upfront costs. There may be rental subsidies available, and I'm going to talk about that later. However, there are some downsides to rental. One is that you may have to move if the landlord terminates the lease. Now, a landlord, typically the leases run from year to year, although that can vary depending on the lease. But you are not guaranteed to keep your apartment even if you have paid your rent on time when it comes to the end of your lease term. At that point, with proper notice, a landlord can terminate the lease regardless of whether you have paid your rent on time. And we see that happening where the landlord has sold the building or the landlord wishes to convert the property to condos. And so they terminate the lease in that situation, even though individuals may have paid their rent on time. The other situation that arises even more frequently is while the landlord doesn't terminate the lease, the landlord will increase the rent, sometimes quite significantly, when it comes time to renew the lease. So those are downsides to leasing. While it's cheaper up front in most cases, it does not give you long-term stability in your housing. Another issue with renting is if the individual has loud outbursts or other kinds of behaviors that would disturb neighbors, that could make an apartment an inappropriate form of housing. Now, home ownership is one I'll be talking about some more in a minute. This one does provide stability in terms of you're not subject to a landlord terminating the lease. You're not subject to a landlord increasing the rent. Now, typically you would have a mortgage, and if you have an adjustable rate mortgage, that monthly mortgage payment may increase based on the terms of the mortgage, depending if to what market rate it is linked. So it could be an increase, but it is not an arbitrary increase and is rarely as much as what a landlord might increase it. There are issues, and I'll talk about them a bit more, about having someone who will arrange and pay for maintenance and make sure that the mortgage is paid and utilities are kept on. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Shared housing, where you would have a private living space plus shared living spaces. Life sharing is one form of that. There is another form, another housing type that I neglected, unfortunately, to put into these slides, and that is a housing co-op. Now, I've asked Suzanne Erb, who actually lives in a housing co-op, to speak to this particular form. It is and I say specific because it is governed by a separate Pennsylvania statute from homeownership or from rental. So, Suzanne, if you could unmute yourself and give us a thumbnail sketch of housing co-ops.
Suzanne, you should be able to unmute now. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I have been living in a co-op for 27 years, and I love it. What a co-op is that it's a form of housing. It's an apartment. I live in an apartment building, and what is different about a co-op, sometimes people get co-ops and condos mixed up, but they're very, very different. With a co-op, you don't own your apartment the way you do with a condo. With a co-op, you own a share in the building. So you have shared responsibilities with your other housemates, apartment dwellers. People are on committees. We have committees for membership, and we're all members of the community. We have things going on. We have movie night every Thursday night. Sometimes we have we have lecture series. Sometimes we have like somebody will come and talk about pictures. We have all sorts of things going on, and these are like sort of voted on, and social committees, and all of that is taken care of by the membership. Generally what happens with a co-op is that you are voted in by the membership committee, and it's really hard not to get voted in. I mean, they accepted me, so they'll accept pretty much anybody. No, I'm only kidding around, but still. And they make sure that you can pay for your share. And what you pay for, you usually pay an amount up front, but that's generally, you can also get a mortgage, which I did. It's harder. There aren't as many mortgage companies that offer mortgages for a co-op, but you can find them. And I did, and I got my mortgage paid ahead of time. And so the only charges that I have each month are the carrying charges, and that covers my heat, hot water, everything, electricity, even cable TV. I wish it would cover internet, but it only covers TV cable, which I just don't bother with. But there are some other advantages to living in a co-op are that you don't have to pay taxes like you would if you were living in a condo, because the taxes, your share of the taxes are covered in your carrying charges that you pay each month. And just to give you an example, maybe this is like TMI, but I have a one bedroom, a reasonably large one bedroom in Center City, and I am only paying, I'm paying less than $1,000. And that's for Center City for a large one bedroom with air conditioning, garbage disposal, washer and dryer in the apartment, dishwasher in the apartment. I am in heaven. And I do get, and that also does cover my maintenance. So you get some of the advantages of living in a something that you own. You do gain equity in that because you own that share. And when you move, you can sell it and you will get something back, unlike a rental situation. But I wholeheartedly recommend it for anybody who is able to afford the initial upfront money that you have to put in. Is that helpful?
I'm ready to move. Oh, no, I can't do a one bedroom though. Oh, well.
Oh, well.
But
Oh, and
Suzanne,
there's a
that's,
gymnasium on the third floor.
oh, jeez.
Except
no,
it's not, I can't use it because it's not accessible.
oh,
I know.
uh,
It's all touch screens. I can't use any of the equipment.
oh man.
I know.
But there is a co-op board, right?
Yeah.
And so in theory, you could go to the board
Yes, in
and ask
theory.
them to make a reasonable accommodations to you in the equipment. I mean,
Yeah, in theory,
anybody could
yeah.
do that. Yes.
That's right.
Okay. 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 All right. And there is another version you talk about gaining equity. There is a version called a limited equity, which limits the amount of equity which is done to lower the buy-in price for the next person who buys into the co-op to lower that price. That's another model. But of course, there are downsides in that those people who are already in the co-op will have a cap on the amount of equity they can accrue. But so there are two models, the limited equity and the market rate equity. Okay, Suzanne, that was excellent. Thank you so much. And my apologies to everyone for not including this model. I think it is a very useful model. I will note before everybody runs out and tries to sign up for a co-op or create a co-op, that there is that rule for individuals on the ODP waivers, that 25% rule. You may be familiar with that, which says that that no more than 25% of the units in an apartment and I question, would it apply to a co-op? And that's an interesting question. I don't know that that's ever been raised with ODP, but it might. And if so, they would say that you can't have more than 25% of the residents in the co-op being on an ODP waiver. That remains to be seen. I know there had been conversations some time ago amongst families who were looking to purchase a small apartment building and create a co-op, but that was a challenge for them in that they were looking at having all of the units owned by individuals on the waiver, and that would appear to run afoul of that ODP 25% rule. I will point out that 25% rule is is one that is unique to Pennsylvania. It is not a federal rule.
Audio now unmuted.
So enough on that. But Suzanne, thank you so much. That's really, really helpful. So I want to move on from there.
Suzanne Erb, computer audio.
We received a couple of questions, and so Vision has the full slide deck and can provide that at a later time. But rather than go through every slide and wait till the end to try to answer the questions that have already been submitted and run out of time to answer those questions, I think for those individuals who've taken the time to write and submit questions, I would like to make sure that those questions are discussed. I can't say that there's always answers for these, but and there are some common themes. So I want to get into those first. Let me move along. Here we go. Housing costs. So the one question was, what are the funding options for buying a house for a child with a disability? Now, let me say on this one, it depends who's actually going to own the house. If we're talking about a parent or parents buying the house, they would be the deed holders, and then their adult child with disabilities would be living in the home, typically as a renter. There isn't any specific unique funding sources for that. They would have to get a mortgage or self-fund it if they have the finances otherwise. And the presence of the adult child with a disability doesn't really open up other funding sources for the purchase of the home. It can open up funding sources if there are home modifications required, one of which is the waiver. And there are other sources of funding for home modifications, but the purchase price, no, there isn't. However, if the adult child is not under guardianship and there's a kind of a joint decision that they will be on the deed as the home owner, then yes, there are some specific funding sources for that. The one that I'm most familiar with is from the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, typically called PHFA. And they provide mortgages most commonly for first-time home buyers, but they have mortgages specifically for individuals with disabilities, not necessarily developmental disabilities, but disabilities generally. And the advantage is they have two special add-ons that they can provide in those mortgages. One is an additional financing for the down payment and closing costs. So this is one of the challenges for purchasing a home. If you're going to get a mortgage, typically the mortgage company wants to see that you have enough to fund a down payment. And most commonly, they're looking for about 25% of the purchase price. That can be a significant challenge, a significant barrier. So if the adult child is going to be on the deed holder, then they could qualify for this special add-on to the PHFA mortgage that actually pays the down payment and closing costs. And this is done as a second mortgage. It is known as a soft second, in that although it is a mortgage, that mortgage, that one for the closing costs and down payment, is not payable until the house is sold, so that you're not adding that cost into the monthly mortgage payment. The other add-on that they have is their home accessibility component, where they will also add on funding, again through one of these soft second mortgages, to fund home adaptations, the accessibility adaptations. Now, of course, there are some home accessibility adaptations which are available under the waivers, but they are limited in both the amount and what they can pay for and how frequently you can get that funding. So this is something that is not limited in terms of what it can cover. So that is an advantage if the individual is able and chooses to be a homeowner. I understand that there's a lot of folks who would not fall into that category, but for those, there are special funding options. Now, there's actually some other questions that come under the I'll read it this, but it also has come up in some other questions, and that is about making the home sustainable. That apparently there have been several families in a couple of different counties which have run into this situation where they have wanted to set up a home for their adult child, and this is for an individual who has significant support needs, maybe 24/7, but the county is telling them, oh no, we don't like that idea because we don't think that's sustainable. So we really think your loved one should go into a group home. Well, I think part of that is that there is this mindset, and this is, I think, is part of our housing myth busting project, to move away from this mindset that the only sustainable option for individuals with significant disabilities is a group home. That's just not true. Now, how do you ensure that sustainability? And that's something that, quite honestly, there's not a single answer for that. There's a number of pieces that need to be compiled to create the sustainability. So some of those pieces are, assuming now, if we're talking about somebody who needs 24/7, I'm assuming they would be on the consolidated waiver. The service of the transitional housing tenancy sustaining service, which I talked about in the previous session, and let me see if I can get back to that here. Here we go. So this service is part of helping to make this sustainable, because the service, although I spoke about it in the context of planning to move in, to looking for housing, what kind of housing, help with the move-in, it is also available for sustainability. You see, tenancy sustaining service. So it is specifically for that. And what it does is to assist the participant in maintaining housing. So that can be part of how you sustain this. It is not dependent upon the parents. This is a paid staff that can continue as long as there is a need for that assistance in maintaining the housing. Now, other ways, I will say that other ways that people have looked at is to hire an outside case management or care manager who would assist with that. That's a little challenging because, quite honestly, while there are entities that provide professional care managing, they are focused much more on the medical services and not so much in looking at the housing supports. There was one individual I knew who did that, Joe Scullin, but sadly he passed away. So that is something that I think needs to be considered. I will tell you that there are a number of families who have been working on creating a model that would focus not so much on a medical style care management, but rather on this sustainability function. And two of the parents have actually started their own pilot project, and that have agreed to for me to give out the email address. They are doing a home coordinator project where they are starting by hiring a third person who would perform this kind of sustainability stuff in conjunction, hopefully, with the housing counselor who's doing the tenancy sustaining service. But to do that as a private pay, because right now, aside from the tenancy sustaining service, we don't have a waiver funded service that is broad enough to cover all of this. Anyway, the parents are Peter and Ruth Grillo, Grillo, and the email, let me see if I can, maybe, I don't know if I can put that in chat. Here we go. Let's see if I can put that in chat. Here we go. The email for Peter is GRILLOP at Comcast.net. Okay, there you go. So that's a model that I think should be considered. There are families in Allegheny County who are working with, I believe it's Achieva, to develop a similar model. This is more for adult kids who are medically involved. So there are models out there. I will say that this is an area that I think needs more advocacy. And it's an area where I think that families should consider coming together and pooling their resources in order to hire someone who could float between 2 or 3 homes to provide the sustainability in conjunction with the tenancy sustaining service. So this is the way I think to look at that. It is my hope that at some point, if we can get enough of these models operating, that we can advocate with ODP to create a service specifically for this kind of home manager, if you will, on the basis that if the individual goes into a group home, the group home part of their payment covers a CEO and a program specialist. That's part of what the payment to a group home covers. And those people are responsible per regulation to maintaining and overseeing the operation of the home and the program. However, if you choose not to go into a group home, other than this tenancy sustaining service, there isn't an analogous funding stream in the waiver. So it is my hope that if we can get enough of these operating initially on a shared payment basis, that we can advocate with ODP to create or add a service that would provide this kind of sustainability. Now, there is a question about the care coordinator concept in pilots. I will need to ask that individual if they could put in the chat. I'm not sure what they mean, the care coordination in pilots now. So that one, I can't answer that because I'm not sure what they mean. There's another question about if you get a voucher straight through HUD. And by the way, that's a little confusing because vouchers come from your public housing authority. So I'm not sure what they mean straight through HUD. They're funded by HUD. I'm not sure if there's some special voucher that the individual is talking about. And then it says, and have the waiver, but the waiver is in the parent's name. And again, I need to ask that person to put in the chat because I don't know what they mean. The waivers in the parent's name. If they're talking about the Consolidated Community Living or PFDS or Adult Autism waiver being in the parent's name, that would just means that it's the payee name. It doesn't mean that wouldn't matter in terms of the housing voucher. Okay. And then there is a question, in plain terms, please define supported living, life sharing, or reverse life sharing. And I will talk a bit more about those shortly. I would just point out that as I am an attorney, we are forbidden by the rules of professional responsibility to explain anything in plain language. No, seriously though, I will do my best. And then there is another lengthy question, and I can try and respond to this very specific one, but the piece about the county saying you shouldn't worry about separating the services from the housing, I would definitely completely disagree with that, entirely disagree with that. I think the reason why counties say that is because they are so embedded in this model where if the individual is complex in their care needs, if the parents are older, that the alternative is group home or maybe life sharing, and that's it, and that's how they see things, and everything else is too scary, and they don't want to deal with that because they have this idea that if you get into a group home, you will be safe. I will tell you that that is a myth. I know of individuals, one of whom was my client, who have died in group homes, okay? So it's there by no means necessarily any safer than being in their own home. Yes, there is more challenges in putting together how the home will be managed because there's not that specific funding source like group homes get for the management component. but that does not mean group homes are safer. Okay. So let me move on here with these other terms. And let's go here. And going back here. So actually, I am going to jump to this slide, and I'll talk about some reverse life sharing in a minute. Develop a budget and assess affordability. Now, this is important because there's going to be expenses, and there are expenses depending on what housing model. There are a number of expenses that will come up that you need to plan for. These would be for rental, your first must rent, your security deposit, and there are security deposits often on utilities. And there's your moving costs. There may be costs for furnishings. And so these are all costs, and then ongoing costs of carrying the rent with the potential of having rent increases in the future. For owning a home, there is the down payment, closing costs, which can be covered by PHFA if the individual disabilities is on the deed. And there are also, again, the utility costs, property taxes, which are usually put into the mortgage, but those are expenses. And so it is important to figure out the individual's budget, and not just what the family can put towards this, but also what income they have to put towards this. And it's both for the housing costs and for the utilities and for food. These all have to be figured out. On this slide, I've put here resources that are excellent in this regard. So one is the Financial Education Curriculum by the Pennsylvania Assistive Technology Foundation. And there's two websites there. The Study Money, which is an online version of the educational program. So you can follow that online rather than printing out something. And then you can also get a hard copy at this other URL. The other is another set of materials called the Prepared Renter Materials, PREP for short. These are done by Self-Determination Housing of Pennsylvania. However, to get those materials, and they're quite lengthy, you have to actually take their Prepared Renter program. And there's multiple sessions. They're free and they're given frequently throughout the year. And that link there is to sign up for that series of webinars, which then allows you to download their course materials. Now, at this point, I wanted to ask Ernie if he would be willing to share some of his personal experiences as Ernie lives on his own in terms of developing a budget.
Yeah. Oh. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So at first, before I lived on my own, I've never learned how to budget. It was very difficult. Wasn't learned in high school for me. But now with support, my support staff, of my SSP teaches me how to budget, how to when I go grocery shopping, can I afford the food there, or um pay my rent on time, which I've been paying it on time.
Okay. That's great, Ernie. Anything else you wanted to add? That's okay if that's it. But no. Okay. Well, Ernie, thank you so much. All right. So I want to move along here. And again, I'm going to jump around because I do want to make sure that some of these issues and questions that have come up are answered before we finish tonight. So let me go back to these slides. I'm going to talk about, I want to jump to housing subsidies. Then no, excuse me. I'm going to talk about reverse life sharing. Then I'll talk about that. Okay. So I will jump around a bit, but I just want to make sure that things that have been brought up to me are covered before we finish tonight. So reverse life sharing. Life sharing is a specific service under the waivers that is available to individuals on the consolidated waiver and some individuals on the community living waiver. So the typical model is that the individual on the waiver gets this service added to their individual support plan, the ISP, and they find a provider. This is a service which is done through agencies, and the agency would typically recruit a family, and the individual moves into the home of that family. They receive services through the life sharing provider, many of their services, not all. And then typically the family called the host family, where they live, will be there for overnight, providing some supports overnight and usually an evening meal. So that is the most common model. Family members can also serve in this life sharing model. So a parent can do this as a life sharing host family, or other relatives can also do this as a host family. But my focus is really on where the individual is living in a home of their own, by which I mean they have a lease or they are on the deed. And so there is an interesting model called reverse life sharing, where this is possible. Now, I call it reverse life sharing. You're not going to see that in any ODP literature, but I think it just makes sense to describe it in this fashion, because this is a model which is permissible under the waiver. It is spelled out in the waiver, where it is the individual on the waiver who either owns or rents the home. And then instead of that individual moving into someone else's home, that individual recruits someone or a family to move into their home, whether it is an apartment or a house. So that is a model which I think is interesting. I think it is particularly interesting in a situation that came to me where there were two siblings, one of whom was on the waiver, one who was neurotypical, if you will, and they got along well, and they wanted to share a two-bedroom apartment. By using life sharing, how this would work is that the individual on the waiver would rent the two-bedroom apartment. The other individual would then sublease from that individual on the waiver and through life sharing. And the advantage is that with life sharing, the person who moves in can have a day job, earn money that way, and in addition, that person gets a stipend through life sharing. The person who moved in gets a stipend through life sharing that's supposed to cover their costs in terms of the care they're providing overnight and meals. So that between the stipend, which is tax-free, by the way, and whatever they earn from their day job, they can then use that money to pay rent to the individual on the waiver. The individual on the waiver can then use the money they have collected, say it's from their sibling, to pay their rent to the landlord. So that's an interesting model. You do need to find a provider who's willing to do this kind of reverse life sharing. So that can be a challenge. But it is completely legal. And it is a way of subsidizing the housing costs for an individual on the waiver without going into a group home. Now, there are some limits in terms of the services. They must use the life sharing provider for direct personal supports, for behavioral supports, and for nursing if they need nursing, although they can get community participation supports, CPS, separate from life sharing. So that's the life sharing piece. Now I want to move on to housing subsidies. Subsidized housing. And here we're talking about, it was mentioned before, the voucher from HUD. So there are a number of kinds of different vouchers, which I will describe in a minute. But before I do, I do want to make people aware of what is happening at the federal level that will have a tremendous impact on federal housing vouchers and federal subsidies. Now, what I'm going to read is simply fact. I'm not going to offer an opinion. I will also say that I'm doing this based on research I have done. I won't say that this is a position of the Developmental Disabilities Council, but again, I'm not giving you an opinion. The proposal from the administration, I mean the federal administration, the president, would cut $26.72 billion from HUD's rental assistance programs. Let me repeat that. Cut almost $27 billion from the Housing Urban Development's rental assistance programs, which include the Housing Choice Vouchers, aka Section 8, public housing funds, project-based rental assistance, Section 202 housing for elderly, and Section 811 housing for persons with disabilities. This is estimated to be a 43% cut to HUD's rental assistance programs. So I thought before we go on and talk about these rental assistance programs, I just wanted you to be aware that what's on the table in Washington amounts to 43% cut in federal monies for these programs. Okay, so talking about these programs, there are the housing vouchers, the housing choice vouchers, and these are the Section 8 vouchers. And there are also the project-based vouchers that I also mentioned that are subject to these cuts. These are the housing choice vouchers go to the individual, and the individual then uses them and tries to find a landlord who will rent to them using the housing choice voucher. The project-based vouchers are where the Public Housing Authority has provided housing vouchers not to a person, but to a housing developer. So those housing vouchers are attached to apartment units, not to specific people. So then you apply to the housing authority, but for a unit in a particular housing development, an apartment building, to get a subsidized unit. But should you move from that unit, your subsidy does not follow you. In some cases, the housing authority may find another unit for you in a different complex, but you don't have a right to take that voucher with you. So let's talk more about these Section 8 vouchers. Now, one of the challenges is that with this voucher, the federal government, HUD, sets a maximum on the amount that a landlord can charge for rent. So, given the rise in rents, it has become challenging for individuals to find a landlord who will accept the housing voucher. Although the payment is guaranteed, the maximum amount of the rent that can be charged is set by federal government HUD based on regional levels, regional areas. And so it does limit the amount of rent that the landlord can receive. Let's see here. Now, let's talk about how you obtain this. The application is made at the local public housing authority for these Section 8s. You can find your local public housing authority through the website listed here. If the housing authority opens for new applicants, then you should apply right away. There was one question that came about a person who had been on the waiting list and then somehow was taken off. I can't answer how that happened in this case. I will say that once you are on the waiting list, if your name comes up, you are given a certain amount of time to respond, to provide certain documentation of identity, citizenship basis or immigration status, and income, and you need to do that fairly promptly. So if that's not done, that could result in you losing your slot. And then if you get a voucher, you have a certain amount of time to actually find a landlord that will rent to you. And if you don't, you usually have the ability to request and obtain an extension for more time to find a landlord. But at the end of that extension, if you still haven't found anyone, you generally lose that waiver. That goes back into the pot for someone else, and then your name would be taken off. So let's talk about a way to address the issue of not being able to find a landlord who is willing to rent to you because they feel they could get a higher amount of rent by renting to someone without a Section 8 because they're not limited to the cap placed on them by the federal HUD maximum rental amounts. And that is to rent from a family using Section 8, and in particular, a provision in federal regulations that allows for public housing authorities to provide, in fact, actually requires public housing authorities to provide what are called reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities in the administration of their Section 8 housing choice voucher programs. Now, at this point, I would ask Sabra Townsend, who has some knowledge on this provision and has done some research on this, if she would please unmute herself so she can talk more about that. And Sabra, if you have a slide you want to put up now, I will stop sharing and then you can share. But first, unmute yourself. There we go.
Hi, David. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All righty. So you're still sharing, at least
You want me
looks
to,
like it on
are
the
you
screen.
ready to put yours up? I will stop
I
if you are.
can, yes.
Okay, there we go.
Alrighty. So what I am showing you is a document through the Philadelphia Housing Authority, and you'll hear that also called PHA. Different areas have different names, but the Philadelphia PHA is actually called PHA. And as David said, Housing Choice Voucher is the program that is often called Section 8. And this is a blank document from the Philadelphia Housing Authority that speaks to the issue of reasonable accommodation. This is the front cover letter. There's actually a phone number, and I can, with reasonable certainty, say that this is the accurate phone number. I would also say that 9 times out of 10, you will get a voice recording when you call it. And then here is the actual reasonable accommodation form. I'm scanning kind of slowly, and I'm more than, it's public information. You can Google reasonable accommodation and get this form from any number of housing authorities, but this is the one specifically in Philadelphia. So I'm scrolling kind of slowly to show you what the instructions are. Does anyone in your household require a reasonable accommodation? What the applicant or the resident needs to provide. And then here's the key section: the medical provider needs to speak to the fact that the person does have a condition and agree that they would need a reasonable accommodation to be able to live as independently as they are able. So in their professional opinion, they have a qualifying disability. They do not necessarily have to say what the disability is, but as you see, please explain how he or she is impacted. So they may give an explanation there. And then here is the list of the different reasonable accommodations that you are asking for. So a wheelchair, motorized, a particular unit. You may say that because of the disability that the person has, that there may be a certain number of steps or lack thereof in terms of steps. If there's a roll-in shower, if there's grab bars, whether it's fully wheelchair accessible, how the kitchen counter height is in the kitchen, whether there's a stair glide, etc. Whether or not the person may need a live-in aid to help them live independently, which then would actually extend the voucher. As David said, you may be able to get a voucher through the public housing aid, the PHA, the housing authority, and they speak vouchers. They speak in terms of units. So if one person would get 1 unit, if you had a family and you had a number of family members, then you might have a 3-unit voucher. But if you have one person who receives a voucher, they have a 1-unit voucher. But if their reasonable accommodation is then a live-in aid, that live-in aid then would allow that person to qualify for a 2-unit voucher. And this is the form that you would use to have that happen. And then here are other programmatic accommodations, an extra bedroom or extra space for equipment, whether or not there's an assistance animal, what the role and the type of that animal is, and special accommodations for visual impairments, special accommodations for deaf and hard of hearing. And you'll notice that each of these has a place where the professional has to initial that and then provide their license information, and as it says here, the Fair Housing Act defines a person with a disability as an individual with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits the 1 or more life activities. And so that medical professional is certifying that information. And then again, in Philadelphia, it goes back to an accessibility coordinator, and the decision is then made regarding the individual's voucher and whether or not they require an additional space or even an additional unit on the voucher. So that's the actual form that in Philadelphia, at least as recently as, what is this now? May? As recently as January of 2025, this is the current documentation from the Philadelphia Housing Authority. So with that, David, unless you have other questions for me, I can stop sharing.
Actually, I did have one other. If you could describe what you have found in your research about the ability of a parent or parents who own or are purchasing property and using that to rent to an individual with a housing choice voucher.
Yes. So this isn't what I'm about to say is not specific to just Philadelphia, to housing authorities across the country. There's a federal regulation that provides a exception, if you will, for a relative who may own a property or who may be purchasing a property to actually qualify that property to be accepted into the housing choice voucher program. And then if the individual has a voucher, they can then use that voucher in property owned by a relative. The typical way is that if you are related to a person and you own a property, they typically cannot rent if it's a relative. But if there is a documented disability with a medical professional certifying that, and the property itself qualifies through the housing choice voucher process, an individual who is related to that property owner and also has an HCV, a housing choice voucher, they can then occupy that home, request that home for their living arrangements.
Great, thank you, Sabra.
Now, it's not an easy process. You did mention, David, that often the voucher is, or the housing authority has a waiting list, or there's a period of time when they open the waiting list. And if that is something that is happening, the strong recommendation is that you apply immediately. and that you stay on top of that information immediately to be able to get the actual voucher.
Thanks. That's great. Thank you very much. Let me say, and Saber, at some point you stop your share and then I'll get back
Yep.
to mine. Okay. Thank you.
Thank
There
you.
you are. It must be nice at the beach.
That's where I'm pretending that I am anyway.
Okay. So back to this. So I had told families in the past that one way of making this work, if their adult child was able to get a Section 8, that probably their best bet, since it's hard to find apartments that landlords that will rent to people with Section 8s, that they try to figure out a way to finance the purchase of a home or condo. And sometimes that means refinancing their own home, then using the rent they will receive from the Section 8 to pay towards the mortgage on this second home. So for some people, that's something that can work or could work. I have to say that I'm less certain of that advice going forward, since the future of the Section 8 housing choice vouchers is very much up in the air now. The proposal, in addition to the cuts, if this became part of the budget that would pass Congress, would then send whatever money was left over after that 43% cut to the states, that they would basically have block grants to figure out how they would use the money. So it's really hard to say how this would all work, although the reasonable accommodations are a matter of federal law. It's not just this federal citation there, regulation, but it's statutory. If you noted in the materials that Saber shared, it said the 504 accommodations unit. That refers to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's been long-term federal law. And then we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we do have federal requirements that would apply even if ultimately this money gets block granted to the states. But if it does, it will probably come with significant cuts. Okay, so let's move on. And I'm going to see where I go next here. Here we are. Family contributions. Yeah, so let's go up here. And slideshow. Okay, so families can contribute to housing costs if the self-advocate pays at least, and this is something set out in the federal regulations, and I don't know where they come up with these numbers, but the self-advocate would have to pay $342 a month from their own money. This would be for someone on SSI towards the rent, and the family could contribute the rest without it affecting the individual's SSI benefits. However, another way to do this is for the family to contribute up to a combined maximum of $19,000 in this calendar year to the self-advocate's ABLE account. ABLE accounts are very useful in terms of funding housing costs. And the reason is that once that money is put in, not only is it tax exempt, but it can be withdrawn fairly easily for rent without it affecting the individual's benefits, whether it's SSI, whether it's the waiver, whether it's their SNAP food stamp benefits. It doesn't affect those at all. Furthermore, if a family makes a deposit into Pennsylvania ABLE account, they get a tax credit on their Pennsylvania income taxes, which in turn frees up some more money they can use to make deposits into the ABLE account. Now let me skip over this stuff here. I talked about if the individual is now living in the parent's home, it is advisable, if they have SSI, to charge that individual rent so that that rent can then be deposited into that individual's ABLE account to be used later when the self-advocate moves into their own home. Now, gifts and inheritance for housing costs. Family members should not make gifts directly to the self-advocate if they're on SSI or on the waiver, nor should they put the self-advocate in their will, as that money is likely to reduce or terminate their SSI or possibly to the waiver. So in that situation, if it is a small amount of money, like the 19 grand, they should put that into the ABLE account. Gifts or inheritance over that 19,000 can be or should be put into special needs trusts, but with the understanding that a special needs trust, while it can be used for one-time housing expenses like security deposits, down payments, furniture, and moving costs, generally special needs trusts cannot be used for ongoing or mortgage costs. That's where you want that ABLE account to come into play. Now, another way to do this, however, and this was done with 3 individuals that I've worked with who became home owners, is that their family used their special needs trusts and basically emptied the special needs trust for a sizable down payment, which enabled them to get a much smaller mortgage so that the mortgage payments were affordable to the 3 individuals. By pooling their Social Security benefits, they were able to afford the monthly mortgage payments just using their monthly Social Security. Okay, I talked about that. I talked about reverse life sharing. So let me go back here and see where we're going to go next. So shared housing. Let me go to this. So given the high cost of housing, it may be necessary for the self-advocate to share their apartment or home with another person. And that was the model that I explained for the 3 individuals. In order for them to become home owners, they shared both their special needs trusts for the down payment. They were able to get a special mortgage through Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency that I talked about before, because they were the home buyers. They're going to be on the deed. And they then shared the expenses, both of the mortgage costs and utility costs. Those were split 3 ways. So with their Social Security, they were able to come up with enough money to pay the ongoing mortgage costs and their utilities. So one model is the A-Law model, and this is one where 2 or 3 families formed an LLC, a limited liability corporation, which is really a type of partnership, to combine resources for the purchase of a home. Then their adult children would rent from the home. Unfortunately, the rents would not be enough to cover the family's mortgage payments, so other funding was necessary. In one case, the individuals were all able to get Section 8 housing choice vouchers that enabled them then to have enough money through their rent to cover the mortgage costs, because the 3 individuals living there each got a Section 8. Okay, so that's that. There is a problem with ODP if there are more than 4 residents. That one is probably won't fly with under ODP regulations. There are some restrictions about on shared housing if the setting has the effect of isolating individuals receiving Medicaid funding, home and community-based services from the broader community. There's a lot of information Temple University Institute on Disabilities has about that rule. I had mentioned that 25% rule previously. Another way is to have joint ownership, where the parent and the child purchase the home together, joint ownership with right of survivorship. This avoids inheritance taxes. When the parent who is the co-owner passes away, what you want to do before that happens is to establish a circle of support to assist the adult child with home ownership responsibilities when the parent is no longer around. And this is an area where that housing transition tenancy sustaining service may also be of assistance. Property can also be left by a parent to a child's special needs trust in order to maintain the residence for the adult child. Now, the adult child is not the homeowner. The trust is the homeowner, and the trustee actually has responsibility for oversight of the home. In that situation, hopefully, if there's enough money in the special needs trust, the trustee can hire an outside party who can then provide the management of the house. If you're going to have housemates, co-owners, it is important to have written agreements between the housemates. It is also very useful to create an advisory board with the owners, family, and other supportive persons to provide guidance and support to the homeowners. That was done in the case of the 3 individuals I talked about. Their model is called HomeWorks, and they have a board which is comprised of the 3 individuals, 3 parents, and then an outside individual. And that board, their role is to provide assistance and guidance to the homeowners in the daily maintenance of the home. There is an organization called Regional Housing Legal Services who has in the past and may be able to provide legal assistance in drafting these kinds of agreements. But written agreements are very important when you're talking about joint home ownership. Some other things to consider. is the preferred characteristics of the self-advocate in terms of their housemate. Consider self-interest, shared interest, availability characteristics, and financial ability before you look at the disability. Okay. So I talked about the home ownership before. I will say that an individual with intellectual disability or autism can own property either alone with an or another if they have the capacity to understand with explanation the terms of an agreement or sale. However, that is, I will say, probably prohibited for those individuals who are under a guardianship, because a guardianship is a judicial determination that they lack legal capacity to enter into contracts and agreements of sale. Owning a house or condo does not affect the individual's eligibility for waiver services or SSI, so long as it is the person's primary residence. That means they can still move back with the family if an emergency, for example, if there is a lot of, say, a hot water heater breaks and there's a lot of work needs to be done to, repair the apartment, or a fire breaks out and they need to move in back with family temporarily, that's still okay. It still does not mean that that property is no longer their residence as long as they intend to move back in. And the value of the property has no bearing on their SSI or their waiver. If you're doing this mortgage, again, I've talked about PHFA. The applicant's credit score is very important. There's a great guide from Pennsylvania Assistive Technology Foundation called Sense and Sensibility. There's a link to that, and that really goes through building credit. I talked before about the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency and their special no interest loans, these soft second loans for accessibility modifications and also for the down payment and closing costs. HUD had a home ownership voucher program. Again, all this is in limbo right now. So I couldn't even begin to tell you whether that will continue to exist in the future. Other areas, FHA, insured mortgages, that's available if you have good credit and some money for down payment, which can lower the down payment than most conventional mortgages. There's a website for that. I will say that that is challenging for individuals with disabilities because they usually have not acquired enough money for the down payment and to cover the mortgage costs on an ongoing basis. USDA has a home ownership program. That one, again, is subject to cuts in the upcoming federal budget. So who knows? Veterans Administration has a home ownership program. Again, who knows what's going to happen with the federal budget for that money. Other resources that go towards the cost of living, food stamps known as SNAP. I will also note that the president's budget would present a significant cut in food stamps. So don't know how much assistance that will provide. The Low-Income Housing Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, again, the president's budget would actually eliminate the federal LIHEAP program, give money to the states for them to figure out how they might provide some funding for those costs. But again, that's a big unknown. The state has a property tax rent rebate program. This is not subject to federal cuts, thank goodness. And so hopefully that will continue to be in effect. Rebate for up to $1,000 a year for people in SSI or SSDI if they are paying rent in their own name or buying a home where their name is on the lease, name is on the mortgage. There's a website for that. Employment is another important source of income. Consider competitive integrated employment to increase financial resources. ODP has a number of employment support programs that are available under their waivers. OVR also has employment support programs as well. These employment will rarely affect waiver eligibility, but there are programs that can provide very detailed, individualized guidance as to the potential effect of employment, earnings from employment on a person's SSI or their SNAP or their waiver. One is through the Social Security Administration. They have programs called the Work Incentive Planning and Assistance Programs. They contract with specific agencies in Pennsylvania to provide this kind of counseling. Agencies are called WIPA agencies. You can get that information. I believe it is, here we go, the next slide. By calling the Social Security Administration. Now, there have been significant cuts in staff in the Social Security Administration, if you've been following the news. So I hope there's still somebody there to answer the phone, but that is the phone number. If benefits counseling isn't available through the Social Security agencies, you can ask for that through the waiver, and the Certified Work Incentive Counselors, CWICs, are available through the waiver if you can't get it through the Social Security Administration funded agencies. Preparing for move-in. At this point, actually, I'm going to ask if there are other questions that are in the chat, because I want to make sure I cover any of those. Carrie, if you see anything, if you could let me know.
I have been forwarding them to you as they've come in.
Okay.
I
Okay.
think you've been answering as we go along.
Well, and then I'll look. Okay, there was how much are carrying monthly charges, how much initial upfront?
That was for Suzanne Erb
Oh,
on the
okay,
co-op.
okay. Oh, in the co-ops. Good. Okay. Okay. Okay,
That's-
there was the answer. The waiver is in my daughter's name, and she has a section 811 housing choice voucher. Oh, that's a little confusing because there's a section 811 and there's a section 8 housing choice voucher. They're different programs, but they put
That was
that.
someone that you had asked for clarifying
Yeah,
information
right. I
from
see
a,
that.
yeah, okay.
I see the clarifying information, but they put, so if it is a housing choice voucher, it's section 8. Section 811 is actually a different program. But they put the housing choice voucher in the mom's name. Huh. All I can say is you need to take that up with your public housing authority, because I don't know why they would have done that. You need to find that out. Okay, here's one. This is in the life sharing. So I assume we're talking about the reverse life sharing. Can the recruited individual be a significant other in this life sharing model? Okay. So the answer is it cannot be it cannot be a spouse. Now, so significant other leads me to believe that they're not legally married. Pennsylvania no longer recognizes common law marriage. Used to, doesn't anymore. So in that situation, they could be a recruited individual. I will say that the problem would be if the individual, the waiver has a long list of family members who can serve as the host family for whom the home and program does not need to be licensed. If this significant other, and assuming then it's not a spouse, because if it's a spouse, then that's not going to work at all. If it's not a spouse and is not one of the family members as specified in the waiver, then that situation would probably need to be licensed. And that is something that is done by the life sharing agency. And that's kind of a big deal to license it. So that's a situation where, while it's my opinion that it would not be forbidden by the waiver, you may have difficulty finding a provider who's willing to license this life sharing arrangement. In the case where I was talking about siblings, and a sibling moves in, because that the sibling is one of the enumerated family members under the waiver, that does not require licensure. So it makes it easier for a provider to agree to that model. Okay. Okay. Should the family try to get their property qualified for the voucher or wait until the child qualifies for the voucher? Well, the qualification of the property is done by the Public Housing Authority. They have certain rules and inspections that you have to go through in order to have the property qualified. They're not going to qualify. I mean, you could say, yes, I want to qualify my home for a voucher, but if you don't intend to rent to other third parties, people who already have the voucher, then I don't see any reason to try to get your property qualified. If you do that, the housing authority is going to expect you to say, oh, well, look, we have all these people who have vouchers. You just have your property qualified. You should rent to them. And if that's not your intent, then you really should wait until the child qualifies for the voucher to get your property qualified. Doesn't the performance-based contracting have funding for residential life sharing? So the performance-based contracting right now is focused on there would be performance-based levels for those agencies that provide the full spectrum, and there's 3 levels of what are considered residential. The residential so-called group home, the life sharing, and then supported living. So if the agency is getting qualified under that higher level of the performance-based contracting, they would have a higher reimbursement rate, and it's not specific to life sharing per se, but for all their residential services, yes, the agency would have a higher reimbursement rate. That's not just for the life sharing, that would be for their residential homes and for their supported living. I'm not sure how that would actually benefit folks. That it's really too soon for me to say how that might shake out. Purchasing a home with a special needs trust, what happens to the home when the adult with disability dies? Okay, so this is something that when the special needs trust is drafted, the attorney who drafts that needs to make sure that they put into the special needs trust what happens not just to the home, but any money that's left in the special needs trust, what happens to that money. And there are certain provisions in law in order to make it a special needs trust as to how that money needs to be dispersed upon the death of the beneficiary of the trust, and that includes the house. But that's something that needs to be worked with the attorney who writes the trust. I am not a specialist in special needs trusts, so I wouldn't give you advice as to how that needs to be written. I just tell you that you should use an attorney who has experience and expertise in drafting special needs trusts. For example, the certified elder law attorneys are those who have that expertise, and there are others who have that as well, but that's something they need to be aware of and put into the trust. Okay, how would SSDI with disability Medicare and a third-party trust affect funding sources for an adult child purchasing a home in PA? Okay, well, the SSDI, now Social Security Disability Insurance, that owning a home has no effect on Social Security Disability Insurance. And the payments for that, again, has no effect on Social Security Disability Insurance. As far as the effect on Medicare, once again, that would not affect Medicare. Now, the effect of a third-party trust on SSDI and Medicare, that's a question, again, that's above my pay grade. I can tell you that the SSDI and Medicare are not affected by the ownership of a home, but how the third-party trust, which would be more than just the ownership, generally those are drafted so they do not affect SSDI or Medicare. So it should not, but that's, again, beyond my expertise and frankly beyond the scope of this presentation. Are there any other resources for the housing co-op program? Oh, okay, such as where to get information on that. So I would turn to Suzanne for that. Hopefully she can type something in the chat for that. Can I explain the difference between family owned with board model that he described and a microboard? So the difference, the way we have done microboards in Pennsylvania is that we have used them as in part as a means of getting back to the first question we started with, are there ways for parents to fund homes for their kids? A microboard was one way of doing that. I didn't include that in my answer because, in my opinion, microboards will probably no longer be viable models with selective contracting or performance-based contracting. But the microboard was the way we did it was that the microboard incorporated, and so the family owned with a board. The family can own the property and have a board which is not a board of a corporation. In a microboard, we incorporated so that the board were actually board members of the corporation. The corporation could then rent the home from the family who owned the home, and the corporation became the service provider as a licensed group home, even though it served one person, but a 6,400 licensed home, and then got payments which included what are called waiver ineligible costs, which go towards housing. So in this other model, we don't do this, the family ownership with a board. We're not talking about doing it as necessarily a corporation, nor does the family become the licensed provider of services. That the family can own the home and they can reach out to other agencies that would be, which would provide the service, or they can do it as a self-directed model where they would bring in individuals through PPL or through agency with choice, but they would have to find another means of financing the cost of the property. Okay, Cecilia asked me to repeat. Can a person with a disability purchase a home and keep their waiver services? Yes, yes, yes. A person can purchase a home and keep their waiver services so long as it is considered their primary residence. That means, so that would be, for example, if they have a non-driver's ID card, is that the address listed on that? Is that the address listed for their SSI benefits or their Social Security benefits? If they pay taxes, do they list that as their home address? So in that case, then yes, they can most certainly have a property, own a property, and it is would not affect their waiver services. Let me say that if they rent part of the property, so for example, if it was a house, maybe a 2 or 3 bedroom house, and they wanted to rent part of that, that income from the rental of the property would be considered earned income. And that income, just like income from a job, could potentially affect their waiver benefits, but highly unlikely, because the cost of the maintaining that property, a portion of those costs is deducted from whatever they get from rent. So in most cases, it would be a wash. And so it wouldn't count as earned income, but that's something where you would go to that WIPA, that work incentive agency, through Social Security or through a certified work incentive counselor through the waiver, who could do the calculations for you to make a determination whether that rental income might affect the waiver. But property ownership by itself would not at all, as long as it's primary residence. So, is that it for our questions? Did I exhaust? It certainly exhausted me.
You have one more.
One more. I'm
Can
not.
you stop sharing so that I can?
Yes. There we go. I have stopped sharing.
Thank you.
One more. We have built an apartment for our adult son with autism. Could we support him with a mix of self-directed services and services through an agency? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes, yes, absolutely. Now, as I mentioned in the previous session, if in fact the supports that are necessary for your son when he is in his own apartment exceed a combined amount of 14 hours between in-home community supports, CPS, and companion, if they exceed those 14 hours, you will need to get a variance. And I explained that in the previous slides, which you should have access to, about that whole variance process so that you can get the services covered. But that's not really a question because he's living in his own place. It's a question of does, by virtue of him living in his own place, he now needs 24/7, then you need to go down that pathway of the variance process. But you certainly can mix and match between self-directed services and services through an agency. Okay.
Just so you know that the PA, Pennsylvania Developmental Disability Council, does fund our work. In order for us to continue to bring you presentations like this, and David, we do need you to take a moment. I have put the link in the chat. You have the QR code here, as well as I've emailed it to you. So if you would please complete that survey. I'm going to leave it up there for just another second, then I'm going to stop sharing so David can have his slides. Okay. Thank you, David.
Okay. Thank you, Carrie. Okay. Where is, oh, come on now. Up. There we go. All right, so let me finish up here. Let me finish up with what we started our Mythbusters series some months ago now, which is, oh, I have to hit share. Sorry, there we go. Sorry. No, let me move there. With our 3 Mythbusters, people with intellectual disabilities and autism can have a home of their own. I think I just answered that a little while ago. Good planning helps make the move from a family or group home successful. And the previous presentation was in detail about planning. And there are resources to help you with that planning. And then just if you do not have one of the waivers I mentioned before, community living, consolidated PFDS, adult autism, may still be eligible for the OBRA or Community Health Choices waivers. There's no waiting list for those. Some of these services, however, are not available there. In particular, the housing counseling service is not available under those waivers, but they can provide a variety of support services. I've done a presentation for Vision a while back that goes into detail about the differences between these waivers. Here's how you apply for the Community Health Choices waiver. Okay. And then resources. Here's some resources at the end. You'll find them in the materials about various housing options. You don't have to write them down now. You'll get these slides. And I think I already mentioned them before. One I didn't mention in this one, but I mentioned it the last one. Values into Action has a housing toolkit funded by Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council. There is the website for their toolkit. I highly recommend that. In fact, the two resources I most recommend is the PATF Home of My Own, which is in Study Money US, and the Values into Action toolkit. If you don't look at anything else, look at those two. Supports brokers mentioned previously. If you're going to self-direct, there's PA Family Network. The plan, well, all right, you see them here. I won't go into those. I mentioned the prep training. Know your rights as a renter. There's a website there, equalhousing.org. And that also talks about service animals. If you are interested in that, a lot of information on that website about that. Supported decision making is very valuable to assist individuals. I mentioned about the one where we had the 3 individuals and they have a board. So using supported decision making is very helpful there. Disability Rights of PA has a lot of information about substitute decision making and supported decision making. And there is an Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council project funded on supported decision making, which is out of the Lehigh Valley Center for Independent Living. Fair housing rights, there's more stuff. There's stuff about service animals. Vision for Equality. And I believe that is the end. Thank you so much for participating in this. I hope you found it useful. I do hope in terms of advocacy, people will think about working together on the viability through jointly funding housing managers, home managers, something I think would be great for families to come together to do, either through an LLC or even creating an employment co-op, which is permissible under Pennsylvania law. And then also keep in mind the federal budget cuts. I will not tell you what to say or do, but as citizens of this nation, you have the right to express your opinion to your members of Congress and to the president as to what you think about the proposed changes in funding for housing. And with that,
And
I
David,
bid
if you don't
you-
mind,
Yep,
go ahead. If you don't mind, stop sharing.
I will do that.
We have another grant through PA Developmental Disability Council, so
Stop that.
Pennsylvania
Where
Developmental
is-
Disability Council. And this is the registration link. I'm going to go ahead and share it here. So we have a Visit the Capitol Day coming up. It is on Monday, June 2nd, Why Medicaid Matters, Advocacy Day and Press Conference. If you're able to join us, I did put the link in chat. You can find this on our Facebook page if you're unable to click on the link now. It's also available on the Vision for Equality website. If you have any questions, I was the person sending you your slides, so you do have my email address. If you have any other questions for David, you can email them to me and I can make sure that David gets them. They can also be emailed to grants@visionforequality.org. And if you have any questions for Ernie or any of our self-advocates, Ernie will also be forwarded any of the questions that I receive. Ernie, would you like to close us out?
Sure. Thank you again for joining us tonight. I hope you guys have a wonderful week and stay dry.
I'd like to thank Sabra and Suzanne for joining us and adding their expertise to our presentation. David, you are getting wonderful comments in chat as always. Thank you so much. It was extremely helpful that you're very knowledgeable and that they appreciate you giving them the chance to ask questions. David is always open for questions.
Thank you
Okay.
for giving me the opportunity to present.
So I am receiving some that people have still not received slides. They are in the chat. I have attached them into the chat as well as emailed them back out to everyone. David, you were excellent as always. This is the next one that came in.
Thank you all.
All right. Everybody have a wonderful evening, and we appreciate you filling out that survey so we can continue to do work like this. Have a great night.